Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. The military rounds played between India and Pakistan on February 26th and 27th, the build-up to them and the tension thereafter has largely dissipated. The artillery and small arms dueling across the line of control has also largely subsided. Just to recap, India claimed on the morning of February 26th that a sortie of its Mirage 2000 fighters had targeted a quote-unquote terrorist training camp in Balakot, a hilly town in Pakistan's Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, and killed over 300 quote-unquote terrorists and their trainers and handlers. The Indian Foreign Secretary read out a statement before a packed presser in Delhi, however, refused to take any questions. The jingoistic Indian media went into overdrive. On the Pakistan side, the Director General of Inter-Services Public Relations debunked the Indian story, informing the media that while the Indian planes had attempted to come in, the Pakistan Air Force Combat Air Patrol challenged them, whereupon the Indian jets jettisoned their payload and turned tail. No training camp was hit because there is no training camp. The Indian bombs landed in an open area in the woods, felling some pine trees. However, Pakistan had been challenged, so the next day PF was given the mandate to hit targets inside occupied Kashmir, which it did. In the ensuing aerial combat, PF ambushed IAF sortie and downed two planes. The wreckage of one fell in Azad Kashmir. The pilot who had bailed out was captured and later returned. Pakistan, throughout the escalation, showed military professionalism and strategic restraint. The Pakistan Navy did the same with an Indian submarine probe in Pakistan's territorial waters, detecting and locking it in, forcing the sub to snorkel to avoid the kill. The question we shall discuss today is how do we evaluate this crisis? What are the lessons here and where do we go from here? Another important question is that while, despite the growing economic differential, so far India does not have a coercive technological edge over Pakistan, the asymmetry of numbers notwithstanding. What we are looking at 10 years from now, if relations do not normalize and the economic differential continues to increase in India's favor. To discuss this, we have Dr. Rifaat Hussain, Brigadier Dr. Naeem Salik, Dr. Zafar Jaspal with us in Islamabad, and we also have Dr. Salman Shah here in Lahore. Let me kick off with Brigadier Salik. Brigadier Salik, what are the lessons here? And I specifically ask in relation to the fact that the crisis obviously was between a nuclear dyad.
Ejaz, actually, this crisis has debunked so many myths which had been built over the years by the Western and Indian experts. The usual story was that there will be a terrorist incident in India and India will punish Pakistan, and then it might escalate into a conventional conflict where Pakistan will be very quickly defeated, and then Pakistan will start thinking of using nuclear weapons. And this was generally the scenario which was repeated in various tabletop exercises, war games, and other articles. But this crisis has proven that actually this is not going to be the case. Pakistan has substantial conventional capability, which is sufficient to give a bloody nose to the Indians, which was very obvious. In fact, this all thing was encouraged by the 2016 claimed so-called surgical strike by India, and that story was believed by everybody. They just bought into it and started then circulating it again, and they said India has done this successful. Nobody condemned India. Nobody even cautioned India that this is a risky route they are taking. And there is no going back on that. So India, and they said Pakistan did not accept this, denied it because they did not or could not respond to this. So this time Pakistan had made it clear that if there is any violation, Pakistan will respond. So both sides had actually got into what we call the commitment trap. So there was no way out. India had to do something to show off to their domestic public for the hype they had already created, and Pakistan had to respond. And one thing has become very clear, that all the myth of India's superior air force that has also been exposed, because people are now looking at the hard figures where they still have over 200 MiG-21s, which their own pilots call flying coffins. And you are talking about 10 years I have been watching for last 10 years once India announced the plan to acquire 126 frontline aircraft. They have not yet got even one, and probably next 10 years they might only get the Rafale, which they have already signed the deal. I don't think there will be too much of a difference. Pakistan will never be a pushover.
Okay. I will, of course, come to the economic differential, and I have Dr. Salman Shah primarily for that reason here. But Dr. Rifaat Hussain, 2016, they went for a fire raid across the line of control. They were blocked at 2 points of ingress. They came in about a kilometer and a half at the third point, fired at certain hutments and exfiltrated. We did not respond at that point for various reasons, not least the fact that nothing had really happened. And we saw the Indian media go into overdrive, as they always do. And, you know, there was a lot of talk about creating a new normal and the rest of it. But this time, after Pulwama, when India said that they will do something, and, you know, considering that Modi is looking at a tough upcoming election, there was a general sense that they're going to do something. And so after the National Security Committee huddle, a policy statement that was released clearly, cautioned India against doing something and advised restraint, but also said that in the event that India tries to do something, Pakistan will respond. So my question is that regardless of the fantasy raid in Balakot, the fact that they tried to hit a place inside Pakistan mainland, do you think that it was then imperative, having drawn that red line, for us to actually respond?
Well, absolutely, because there was no other way that Pakistan have chosen to respond to this act of Indian aggression. And we had made it absolutely clear that if we get attacked, or if there is a strong violation of the LOC, and let alone, you know, sending 12 MiGs, a fleet of 12 MiGs to attack several targets inside Pakistan. So once the Indians had decided to embark on an aggressive venture against Pakistan, so Pakistan was left with no option but to respond. And our response was a measured one. It came the next day, and whereby we were able to lock on to some targets along the LOC. And I believe that apart from the downing of the 2 Indian MiGs, we had also destroyed some ammunition depots, and, you know, some damage was done. But luckily there was no civilian casualties. So Pakistan was well within its right of self-defense when it undertook that action. So that actually, the earlier question that you asked Naeem Salik about what is the methodology and what is going to be the future of deterrence, I think 2 things are absolutely clear. One is that a country which gets aggressed against is is a defender has a inevitable advantage against the aggressor. Number 1. Number 2, it is not only the capability factors, but the intention and the resolve factor is very, very important. And in this case, Pakistan is dealing with an enemy which is, you know, 4 to 5 times the size of Pakistani forces in all its dimensions, but yet careful planning and, you know, well thought out strategy and, you know, defensive measures ensured that Pakistan will prevail in this conflict. So I think it calls into question the earlier assumptions about India's behavior, that India is going to be a big country, it's a large country, it has a larger force, and therefore it is likely to prevail against Pakistan. But Pakistan, with a smaller force, with a leaner and a meaner force and a well-skilled force, lived up to the challenge.
Okay. Dr. Zafar Jaspal, let me go to what Brigadier Salik said. And I think that's very important. I've been saying during this crisis that essentially it was always going to be the first round, thing, in the sense that for a very long time, and that's what Brigadier Salik also implied, there was within India also and also among the Western scholars and policy wonks, there's been this sense that there is a band in which India can play, and that is below the nuclear threshold, and that somehow everyone had convinced themselves that in the opening gambit, India will succeed. And therefore, when India succeeds, Pakistan will have to restrain itself, because going early and first into a nuclear escalation will bring the full weight of diplomatic isolation and international opprobrium. Now, the entire argument was pegged on the assumption that India will win the opening round. Now, having seen what has happened, do you think that assumption was correct? And if it is not correct, or if it wasn't correct, how come so many scholars just simply lapped it up?
Ejaz, I think that I concur your view as well as what Dr. Salik and Professor Rifaat were mentioning. But here it's very important that since 1999, 2001, 2002, 2008, we have seen that at some, you can say, extent, India's compelling strategy was successful. And later on, we have seen that in 2016, when they announced the surgical strike, Pakistan's response was rational and mature. But generally, it was interpreted that, oh, Pakistan was shy to respond or something like that, though we said it was a fictitious strike, or not, there was no strike, but those strikes were cashed politically by Prime Minister Modi. But this time when they did, so Pakistan has no option but to respond. Yes, first, I think the analysts who were writing on these things, they were missing one element, that Pakistan has a viable standing armed forces and they have a capacity to defend their borders. And that's why when India started talking about the limited war, Pakistan said, okay, limited war is not an option because it could escalate. But at the same time, Pakistan started preparing for limited war. If you see Azmeno or all these kind of things, even within the nuclear dimension, Pakistan prepared by introducing the battlefield weapons, in the which we call it generally in the tactical weapons. And second is the literature which we have been reviewing. It was overwhelmingly biasly circulated, and they were trying to indicate Pakistan will be isolated. But the question is that in this modern world, in a globalized, interdependent, interconnected world, this term that Modi can isolate Pakistan is too difficult. So Pakistanis have started realizing this, and that was the clear. And if I can give you, I do agree with you that this perception was very strong, that even on 26th, when they crossed the border, it was a violation against a nuclear armed state. And what was the Mike Pompeo was saying, that it was a defensive measure, it was a defensive counter-terrorism measure. So indication was, or what they were thinking, that Pakistan was not in a position to respond. And once now Pakistan had responded, after that the thinking has started differently, and all P5 and other brotherly countries started pressurizing both states that we should follow the restraint. Though Pakistan has been following the restraint, but on the other side we understand that Modi, because of the election, has under compulsion their military establishment after the approval of their defense budget, 45 billion plus. It has a different take on it. The defense industry has a different take. But if you see, have you seen this kind of an article in the New York Times in which they were mentioning India has a vintage military? Yeah. Earlier they were saying that India is a very strong power, Pakistan has no capacity to fight. Today they are saying India has a vintage military. So it's a change of the perception overnightly. So this is a new thing which we have to take into account.
Absolutely. And I'm going to come back to the three of in Islamabad about how India used the word preemption and the moral hazard involved in that. But let me, on this note, come here to Dr. Salman Shah. Dr. Shah, I'm just going to quote from a work in progress. This is not my work. This is Dr. Ali Hasnan, who's an economist, teaches at LUMS. And he's working on this, essentially in terms of the economic differential between India and Pakistan, and how that is likely to impact defense spending and the rest of it. Of course, there's lots of variables here, and as I said, this is a work in progress. Now, one of the important things is that since 1992, there's been a significant decline in Pakistan's economic power relative to India. And he says that in 1991, the Pakistani economy was 17% as large as India's. By 2017, a decade and a half of being outmatched on economic growth has left us less than 12% of their size. Then, since the 1980s, every major South Asian economy has improved its citizens' health, and since 1990, its wealth faster than Pakistan. So, the issue about military strength, it is the aggregate size of an economy, not simply its relative performance, that determines the ability to spend on defense. In the 5-decade period between 1963 and 2002, India generally grew slower than Pakistan, yet there were 6 instances of India's annual economic growth exceeding the size of Pakistan's entire economy. More worryingly for the strategist, in the 15 years since 2003, India has achieved this feat 9 times. Now, Mike, I have 2 questions in the opening round with you. One, if this differential grows, how will this impact? Because if India actually manages to transform its vintage military into a more capital-intensive, technology-intensive military where it actually gets technologically coercive platforms, how is that going to play out? And why is it that our economy is in this strange kind of cycle?
Ejaz, I think this is a very good question, but at this point in time, if without going into the numbers which you just quoted, I would say that the Indian economy is around 7 times the size of the Pakistani economy. And the Pakistani defense spending is around 3.5% of GDP. And India...
Hasn't it dropped to about 3.1 or something?
It keeps going up and down, but at the moment it's around 3.5, and India is doing around 2.5.
Yeah.
So it's not that India is really draining Pakistan in a very major fashion, and that once it's outspends Pakistan even today at least 5 times
it's already according to CIPRI, it's already among the top 15 spenders on defense, and I think it's at number 6 or 5 or 6.
The other thing is that the Pakistani defense budget also goes much longer than if it was like Saudi Arabia or some other countries, because of the efficiency which we have been able to achieve. And so at this point in time, I don't see that they can drain us, at least in the short run. Now, having said that...
short term would be how much?
I mean, you mentioned 10 years. 10 years is, I think, a very short period of time.
Oh, okay.
But certainly, if we don't start to perform, and the differential in growth rates continues for, let's say, the next 20, 30 years, then the differential will become really a very big thing. And at that point in time, then your conventional ability to invest in your conventional defense will really be strained. So I think that given the current situation, and if we can have an environment in which we can actually match our growth rates with the Indian growth rate, and this is something which has been talked about for the last 5, 6 years, maybe even 10 years, that the economic, because if you look at it up to almost 2007, between 2004 and 2007, our economic growth rate was at par with Indian growth rates, and our economy was doing fairly well. But for the last 10 years, we have grown at the differential is at least 3%.
But let me.
Now that is causing.
You were actually looking after the economy during that period. But here's the thing, that was because of factors other than economy itself. Political-strategic factors where we had the fiscal space, we were doing certain things, there were rescheduling of debts and the rest of it, and the global economy was in an upswing. There was a lot of money inflows, but the actual problems in the economy were not really addressed.
No, I think the main factor, I think, which was responsible for the high economic growth over there was, number one, the government revenues increased from, in 2000, they were around $5 billion a year. The entire revenue picture which FBR was doing was $5 billion per year. And by 2007, it had gone to $18 billion a year. So the differential, if you look at the amount of revenue which was being generated by FBR, actually helped you to invest in the economy, and that's why your infrastructure investment went up. That's why you were able to invest in the social sector also. But having said that, the reforms on a sustainable level have yet to be done. If you look at the period from 2007 to 2018, we have not focused on reforms at all. And particularly if you look at the last 5 years, we have focused on expanding, for example, the power sector. We have failed to do any reforms whatsoever, but we have pumped in a lot of money into a non-functional kind of a power sector.
Without really addressing the structural problems.
The structural problems, because without addressing the competition issues, without making a power market, without reforming the discos and the generation, and continuing to do projects based on kind of non-competitive upfront tariffs which were very, very high, and now we are paying a big price. But I think that if we are going to look at the next 10 years, we must have an economy which starts to grow, and in that respect, I think CPEC is going to be very, very important.
I will come to that.
And that is something which is going to be a strategic economic investment, because investment climate, as you know, investment is what makes the economy run. And if the investment which is coming from China, if it is used wisely and most efficiently,
that's a big if.
That's a big if, but that has to be done. That has to be done.
Yeah, I'll come back to that. In fact, I'm also going to ask because I know that you're currently also involved in some of the structural reforms, the task forces and the rest that the present government is doing. We'll come to that. But after this break, stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We're discussing the situation between India and Pakistan. Of course, the fact that the immediate tensions have kind of subsided, but where do we go from here? What exactly are the comparative strengths and weaknesses here? We've also talked about the Pakistan economy and the differential between the Pakistani and Indian economies. But one important point that I raised before going on the break was the fact that on the morning of 26th Feb, the presser that the Indian Foreign Secretary gave and the statement that he issued had used the word preemption. Now, this was something that Dr. Zafar Jaspal referred to, not exactly in these terms, but the fact that, what the US Secretary of State said as a counterterrorism measure. Now, India tried to use this term preemption. It's a very, this language is very US, Israeli kind of language. As a matter of fact, Robert Fisk wrote an article during the crisis in which he said that the language that is being used by India has the Israeli footprints on it. So, Brigadier Salik, give us a sense of the moral hazard involved in preemption, because under Article 51 of the UN Charter, which deals with self-defense, the language does not talk about if an armed attack is about to occur, or it says, if an armed attack occurs, which means that, in self-defense, you can only respond when you are being attacked. So give us a sense of why India used this term preemption.
This is very interesting, especially if you look at the selection of the target. If it had been close to the LOC, they could have claimed that these people were preparing to launch from the so-called launch pads close to the LOC. So any action or attack was imminent, and that's why they preempted. Now, in this case, the only occasion where you can have a preemptive attack is that if an attack or hostility is imminent. So how did they determine that it was imminent and they went so far deep into Pakistani territory? This actually negates their statement, because if they were there, there was no imminence of any activity from there. And then since the Pulwama attack, the incident itself, they had been talking about taking revenge. So it was not a reprisal attack, it was not a revenge for Pulwama incident, and they actually said that they are trying to carry out this strike as a preventive or preemptive strike.
Now, hold on, Brigadier Salik, sir.
Future attacks.
This word preventive is very important here. Now, we know that there has been a lot of debate on these two terms, preventive and preemption. But we also saw that during Bush's period, there was a deliberate conflation of these two terms. And there was a lot of debate within the US on this deliberate conflation. So what exactly are we talking about? Are we talking about a preventive act, or are we talking about preemption? Because in 1967, when Israel attacked, it said that this was a preemptive attack. When they attacked the Iraqi reactor, it was a preventive attack. So the moral hazard becomes greater when we talk about prevention, and probably lesser when we are talking about preemption, especially if we also bring in the element of, the fact that this is something which is imminent.
Actually, this is setting wrong precedents, and the terms, in fact, once during the Bush time, these terms were used, and Sir Michael Howard wrote a very scathing article criticizing the use of these terms, and he said that unless the hostilities are very imminent, there is no justification for any preemptive or preventive attack. In this case, how did they justify the imminence of any attack? Because as I said, if these people were supposed to be close to the LOC on the so-called launch pads, which Indians describe the places from where these people infiltrate across the line of control, then one could say that the attack was imminent. But in this case, there was no imminence. And so there is a lot of confusion in the Indian narrative. And you listen to different experts, the government spokespersons, the retired military chiefs. So everybody has a different story to tell. Basically, I think they are trying to justify their action post facto.
Okay. I have a slight difference of opinion here, Dr. Rifaat Hussain, from what Brigadier Salik is saying. I think this is not about confusion. I think there is a deliberate, employment of these terms, because, as you know, under international law and also the prevailing circumstances, there is a certain kind of narrative, and these terms plug into that narrative, especially when preemption is juxtaposed with an assumed target where presumably, quote unquote, terrorists have been hit. So it kind of plugs into a larger narrative. Would you agree with me?
Well, I absolutely agree with you. These are not legal terms, these are political terms, and their employment takes place in the context when the attacking country or the aggressor country deems it in its interest to employ these terms. So these are not legal concepts, and there is a big debate in international law where they say that you may have a reason, provided you can be a justification that there is an emerging threat on the horizon and you are going to fall victim to that attack. But in this case, when the Indians said that they were engaging in a preemptive act, but what did they achieve? there was no damage that was done. There were no bodies. There were no damage to the infrastructure. In fact, none of the terrorist camp, which so-called terrorist camp, which they presumed to exist on the Pakistani side, were hit. So the question of the preemption does not arise. Now, when we talk about the preventive, that's a more long-term measure, yes, where the countries try to compete with each other and they try to bring about each other's downfall through a prolonged game of the struggle for power. So, but in this case, the Indians' use of preemption was totally unjustified, and I don't think that anybody can put up a legal defense for the Indian employment of this term.
Okay, Dr. Jaspal, taking this forward, back in 1959, when Bernard Brodie wrote that canonical work, Strategy in the Missile Age, he discussed at length both the preemption and the preventive side of offense. As you know, and you teach this stuff, that there was a lot of debate at that time about how you could actually fight a nuclear war and win a nuclear war. And finally, all of that was laid to rest mercifully, because people realized that you cannot fight a nuclear war or win a nuclear war, no matter whether you using counter value or counter force and the rest of it. So do you also think that the Indians are using this term deliberately, or do you think that it just simply reflects confusion on their part?
No, I think that they were using it very carefully and deliberately, because if you see that since the last 2 decades, we have seen that this term has become very significant, the preemptive or preventive war. Now, in this context, when they use the word preemptive, they were focusing on it, and even they used this term in 2016, because they were saying that they preempted and they were hitting the terrorist camps which were planning to attack on them. So in that context, they try to justify, because they cannot use the preventive in a manner because the power was not evolving. Preemptive gives the indication that the power is there and which was about to fire, and that's why they hit that. So that's why. And secondly, if you see in the American-led Western world, which is very much close to the India, especially because of the American strategic calculation and India's significance within it, these terms are very much acceptable in the Western literature or in the Western countries. And that may be one of the reasons that if you see that when they say that we have preemptive, because we have to not forget here, in the last few years, the Indians, this narrative that they are victim of the terrorism sponsored by the Pakistan or these jihadi organizations. So they are all accepting whatever the India is saying. And even after the Pulwama attack, many countries or their allies accepted this, that India is a victim. And in that case, when they say that there is a further chance of attack, they were using these terms. So my understanding is that they use this term keeping in mind their allies, keeping in mind the trend in the global or Western world, and keeping in mind
absolutely.
What is the usage of this term, the way they are looking.
Absolutely. And I think what Dr. Rifaat Hussain said about these terms not really being acceptable in, under international law, except the fact that the political terms, and the Americans have been trying to create what one scholar, David Kennedy, called lawfare. Anyway, I also am joined by Vice Admiral Asaf Hamayun, who also served as Vice Chief of Naval Staff. Welcome to the program, Admiral Hamayun. I specifically want to ask you about the incident of the Indian submarine, which we believe was detected and locked into and then had to snorkel as a gesture of appeasement. Can you give us the technical and sort of strategic dimensions of this?
Thank you very much, Mr. Ejaz Haider, and my salam to all the rest of the panel members. You see, one of the things about submarine warfare is that unless they are in position at the start of the war, they can become targets in a aerial strike or a strike on enemy ports, and then they cannot participate in the war because they would be damaged. So submarines have to sail out before the start of the war. This submarine was detected about 60, 70 nautical miles south of our coast. It was, about 40, 50 miles south of our territorial seas. So India, in fact, if you recall the press conference, joint press conference of 28th February, in which Indian Armed Forces representatives participated. Indian Navy representative came on and told the press that Indian Navy has deployed or is deploying for any conflict with Pakistan. So this submarine had sailed out and was in position. And Pakistan Navy, I would say, was because of its professional acumen, because of its vigilance, because of its ability to detect submarines, detected the submarines, and this submarine was detected at 8:35. You can see the time, 8:35 p.m., which is after sundown. And the technical ability of our ASW aircraft, as well as the acumen of the crew, the video seems like that it has been shot during daytime. But the important thing is that this submarine could not detect our aircraft, and our aircraft was able to not only detect the submarine, but did quite a long video of it to show that the Indian submarine has been spotted.
So, Admiral Hamayun, I need to ask you this because the submarine snorkeled. I want to find out if submarines snorkel either in enemy territorial waters or very close to them.
Here, I would say that this is a conventional submarine, and even the best conventional submarines have to snorkel at least once in 24 hours to remain ready to attack. To remain ready to attack, they have to keep the batteries pretty charged up, quite at a high level. And so this submarine had to snorkel. But at the same time, so modern submarines are outfitted with a lot of gadgetry to make sure that they can snorkel without being detected by the enemy. And they have, of course, infrared and night vision devices, which would tell them if there is any enemy aircraft around them. And they also have what you call a radar detector. So if enemy aircraft is using radar, it will also be, they are capable of detecting enemy aircrafts also.
Okay.
Yeah, but the good thing about this whole incident is the profile and the way, the tactical employment of its own sensors by our aircraft in a manner that the submarine could not detect the aircraft.
Okay, that's important. Thank you so much. That was Vice Admiral Asaf Hamayun talking to us. I have to wrap up the program also, Dr. Shah, about our efforts to restructure the economy. Where do we stand? I think there are task forces looking at various types of reforms. What exactly are we doing?
I think our target should really be to be an investment hub to begin with. We need to bring in a lot of investment. China is already bringing in. Saudi Arabia has committed almost 20 billion. Other countries are doing it. So all the reforms needed to make it easy to operate in Pakistan, do business over here, reduce the cost of doing business in this country.
No,
that is very important.
It's not just about the money coming in.
No, but the money will only come in if you have done the reforms, or at least you make everybody comfortable. Because this money,
the Chinese have already put in a lot of money.
No,
and I don't think
that is public sector investment. We are really talking about private sector investment. Chinese
so for
companies,
private sector investment,
yes.
If you do not have an investment climate that actually induces the Pakistani investors to invest, how much can we expect from the foreigners to come and invest?
I think number one is that China is really committed to investing in this country, and there are special economic zones being set up all over the country, and we have to make sure that those are successful. And that means...
How do we make sure of that?
Because of your regulatory environment.
Is it conducive?
Of course, we can. I mean, everything is possible. because every other country has done it. It's not that there is some manufacturing defect that we can't do it. We have a very large working age population. We have a very youthful...
World Bank reports have been suggesting that India's environment for business is far less conducive than Pakistan's. And yet, India attracts more foreign investment.
No, I think in the recent years, 2-3 years, Modi has carried out very deep reforms, particularly in the bureaucratic area. And now it is ranked almost, it has improved its ranking in the Global Competitiveness Index from almost, it was much worse than us. It is down to about 30 to 40 ranking, which is very, very good. And Pakistan can also do the same. I think the PTI government has that kind of thought process, but to be able to do it, you have to bite the bullet and deregulate what is needed. Number two, I think for Pakistan, it's very important that our export competitiveness is able to give us the markets in the region, and particularly if we have an FTA with China, we should be able to penetrate into the Chinese economy. China is a very large importer. It's probably the largest importer in the world also, and if you have...
What can we import to China, export to China?
I mean, we can, for example, China imports about $50 billion worth of meat from Australia. I mean, they import vegetables, they import consumer goods, they import intermediate, they import everything. It's a very, very large economy. And secondly, I think the offer of Lindsey Graham about a free trade agreement with the US, we should seriously take it up and talk with the Americans about this. And an FTA with America and an FTA with China would really mean that you are now setting yourself for being an economic hub. And that means that you create that environment in which investors can feel safe, in which your labor can be trained and the productivity can be increased. Because what we are lacking in terms of competitiveness and productivity is really investment in modern technology.
Okay.
And this is, we have the basic ingredients. One more point, I think if we look at our water, which is a very important resource of Pakistan, I was looking at it that we have almost 150 million acre-feet of water every year in our rivers. If this was in Australia or California, they would be generating about $300 billion out of it.
Okay.
And we are only doing 50. So you can imagine what the kind of productivity improvements you need in agriculture, in industry, manufacturing, etc.
I have to wrap up now. That's all the time I have for this program. We'll see you tomorrow. Until then, it's goodbye.